I'm not sunflowers, it's peanuts. Yeah, I love the salted peanuts.
Good afternoon. I hereby call this special meeting of the Nacogdoches ISD Board of Trustees to order. Let a record show that a quorum is present, and notice of this meeting was legally posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act. Board member Mindy Winslow is running late, but I anticipate that she'll be joining us shortly. Please join us in turning your cell phones to the silent mode. Right, public comment. We did not receive any requests to address the board today as outlined in the meeting notice. That will take us to item 3 on our agenda today, our debt service workshop, and I will call on Dr. Trujillo to make introductions.
President Finch and board, we're excited today to have capital markets here with us to present some of the update us on some of our information that we've already, the wagon has left the barn, so we just want to get an update with all the information that's out there. And we've got Clarence with us. Clarence is actually at the microphone with us, and we've got he'll introduce his partner, and I'll turn it over so we can get started. And I promised Reverend this was going to be a good one. So, just an update. So,
Clarence, it's good to see you
Good
again.
to
If I
see
may
you
welcome you,
again.
we appreciate you making the trip in to give us a good update.
Yes. Can you hear me just fine here?
Yes.
Am I on? Well, again, good afternoon. My name is Clarence Greer. I'm a managing director with RBC Capital Markets, part of your financial advisory team, headed by Bob Henderson. The San Antonio office, also manager director. And collectively, it's always good to come back and do a post-op of of a bond election. And all the bonds, we had a successful bond election. All the bonds have been sold. But there are certain strategies that we discussed going into the election. And as we sold the bonds, we thought that we would revisit those strategies to see, should they be modified? Should we be looking at different strategies in light of current variables that I'm going to review? So if I could just take, I think we're going to do this one or two ways. We can make it interactive, or we can just run through it for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we have questions. Your pleasure, where we could work through each type of scenario.
Preference?
But there's a preference.
Either or is fine.
Either way is fine.
I think we have a question we can ask, right?
Yeah, I was about to say probably we tend to be pretty interactive with questions, so we probably
That's perfect.
We'll
That works.
that way.
That works best. And this is a workshop. Feel free to ask questions. We've been working very hard with your CFO, Lisa Maberek, who's done a wonderful job managing and positioning you, and we'll get into that. So we're going to be very judicious with the time. Let me spend about 3 to 5 minutes covering the first couple of pages, and then we'll transition into the meat of the presentation and the strategies and some of the items that I had mentioned earlier. You can see...
Clarence, if you'll permit me, just to make sure you're aware of this, and President Finch, we've only had one change in the board when you first presented to the information, and I wanted to make sure that Leah Beth, you're aware, she was not here whenever it was initially put out. So when you see particular questions and updates, I wanted to make sure be respectful to any questions she may have, because she's not at the same place as some of the other boards, but we wanted to make sure that she would do a diligence with
Yes, sir.
Leah
Thank
Beth.
you.
So.
Thank you. On page 2, you can see our contact information of the management team. We do have a third party. Our Dustin Trailer is also part of the banking team, but you can see our contact numbers and information is on page 2. But on page 3, I guess, I think we started from a really good point then, in light of, just giving a historical perspective of the district's debt election history. What you have before you on the first part of the table are just, from going back to June 2001, the elections and what the purpose was and the amount, and you can see whether it passed or not. And so we had a successful bond election of $46 million 46.855 million in June of 2001, which passed. And then that was followed up from September 2007. That's a tax ratification election. That was not for facilities, but it was to give you some flexibility on your maintenance and operation side of your budget. And that passed as well. But then, in 2014, May of 14, we had 58.78 million that was on the ballot. And you can see that actually failed, 44.71 approval rate. And then came back the following year, that November, with a slightly different amount, slightly lower proposition, and 43.3 million, and it also failed by a similar rate. And so, there's 3 years that passed. The master plan was dusted off, and things were added to it. And interesting enough that, just under $78 million. You can see the vote turnout was significantly higher in November 2018 versus the previous 2 years. That they coinciding with the just general probably election, or what was going on in the state with the governor's race. But a 67% approval rating. And that's a Herculean adjustment for the community. I know a lot of workshops were done. I know that the board worked extremely hard to get the message out, and it was one message. And we looked at the capital improvement plans and made some hard decisions as to facilities and what we were going to do, and different strategies, and worked as a unit, as a full team. And I think that team also included your constituents and the community. They had a voice. And so I think bringing them into the fold made a difference. Lisa did a great job with the numbers, and we supported her in that effort, and that culminated in a very successful election. So we made a lot of promises. So our job today is to kind of talk about what promises did we make, and the expectations we laid out for the community, and how are we doing with those expectations. And so there are a lot of assumptions and highlights we have for the board, but one of which is highlighted. When we held the bond election in November 18, the maximum interest and sinking fund tax rate was supposed to be 38 cents. And that was approved. Everyone understood it. I think at the time we were still, south of 24 cents. And so it went up. Everyone understood what that meant in terms of average homeowners. We had all the calculations. Now, Bob is going to talk to you about where we are today. It's nowhere near the 38 cents. And we've been, so I guess one of the reasons we say, well, maybe the values have gone up. Well, when you look at the next page, and we'll come back to page 4, but go to page 5 to keep this thought alive here. And you can see back in 18, our values were about $1.9 billion. You see TAV, that's the taxable assessed value where you levy the tax and collect revenues from. And now we're just $2.2 billion in 22 fiscal year. But notice the variance. It was we were coming off of a 6% growth just on the previous year in 17 to 18, followed by just a 2.92% growth in tax assessed value. Then it spiked to 8%. Then it's a negative 3.74%. So we actually had a decline in our values that we're collecting revenues on. And then we had, obviously, another 8%. So that averaged about, over the last 10 years, about 2%. Last 5 years, it's average. That growth is about 3%. And so we haven't had a lot of robust growth consistent in terms of the average. So how have we been able to maintain our tax rate promise? In fact, we're nowhere near 38 cents. Well, one of the things we've done is we've been subsidizing the rate itself to help, with the transition to the higher rate. And so instead of allowing it to go from, say, 20 cents to 38 cents, we've been very judicious. And if we had extra funds, we've been putting some extra funds from the interest and sinking fund balance toward the payment of debt. So it lessens the burdens on the taxpayer. So, and we'll get into the difference in that and the implications. So Lisa's done, and the board and the superintendent have done a Herculean job of holding taxes steady and actually, really lower than what we actually had originally stated. So let me stop there to see if there are any questions about the setup, and then we'll transition into, what actually happened.
I'd probably just make the comment that I've been extremely impressed. I remember when we started this, we said year one, we're not going to have that increase, but then starting year two, we were going to start to see that tick, that increase up. And for the fact that we have, through the good management and your recommendations, haven't had to implement that is just amazing. And you are probably aware, but this year our overall tax rate is actually lower than it was last year. When does that happen?
Right.
So.
And we knew that was something that the community had voiced, and so we wanted to promise something that was a little bit more conservative and over deliver. And so I think that has been achieved. Now, going forward, sustainability, I would like to have Bob come in and transition this discussion. But before I do, just as a point of record for the board members, on page 4, let me just circle back just as a point of record and how much debt you have outstanding. So we have just over $94 million of debt outstanding. So we're continuing to pay principal off each and every year. We're not waiting till the year 30 to start paying off principal. It's something that we are very diligently focused on. And looking at the coupon ranges of the bonds, we're going to continue to look for refinancing opportunities as they come up. I think we actually executed a smaller refunding a few years ago. That's something that we're ongoing, always monitoring. And you do have some debt against your M&O budget that's outstanding, but that's separate and already it's for another discussion. It doesn't fall within the workshop's objectives. So I'll transition to Bob Henderson to kind of talk about how did we come in so much lower than the 38 cents. But then more importantly, where do we go from here? And because that's sustainability. I think we kept our promises, but now what? And so Bob,
Can I ask one question,
Yes.
Clarence, before you leave the microphone? I remember there was some discussions early on when we got ready to release the big portion of the bond, whether we were going to do it all at once or in segments. And I recall you saying that, and I think it was good advice, we sold them all at one time, but there were certain criteria that allowed us to do that. Are we still meeting all of those criteria?
Yes, and that was related to a lot of considerations went into that. Yeah. And, part of it, which was, just looking at your rates itself. And
I didn't mean to distract.
Oh, yeah, no, I thought something was falling out, but we met all the criteria. We had rating meetings, and they were fine with it. They were looking at the impact it was going to have on our budget in terms of the operations, and so that was all stable. And so, and it continues to be. And so we're in a great position for that. That's a great observation.
Thank you.
Bob?
Thank you, Clarence. I hope everybody can understand me. I do have a funny accent being from Marshall. You got to bear with me there. It's a great pleasure to be before the board again. As Clarence pointed out, in conjunction with the 2018 election, we had a number of public hearings, and I had the honor of accompanying Clarence on at least a couple of those. To get into the numbers, I really want to kind of recap some of the things that Clarence said and some of the things that our board president said. And I want to draw your attention again to page 5 before I get to the numbers. So I don't know exactly. Thank you. When we had the bond election, the voters were dealt with in a very transparent manner. And we told them that there was going to be a 21-cent INS tax rate increase from the level of 16 and a quarter that you see on page 5, second column from the right, to 38 cents. As Clarence pointed out, we had advertised, and this gets to Mrs. Fitch's point about stair-stepping. We had built into that original transaction what's called capitalized interest, and you also had surplus INS funds. So the idea was we were going to take advantage of extremely low interest rates in 2018. We were going to use capitalized interest and investment surplus INS funds to mitigate the tax rate increases. We weren't going to go from 16 cents to 38 cents overnight. We were going to stair step it. And you can see that even though we sold the bonds in 2018, looking at page 5, you can see that in 2020, after we sold them in 2019, the INS tax rate, in fact, did not change at all. We stayed at 16.25%. We then did the first stair step that was part of the original plan of finance to 24.4 cents. So as Clarence points out, where do we go from here? And with that introduction, let me turn to page 6. And let's focus our attention, if we could, on the column on the far right that is highlighted in yellow. You see in the third line that we're at 24.5 cents now, and the question that this spreadsheet attempts to address is, where do we go from here with respect to the tax rate? And the great news is that this is kind of a worst case scenario. If you look over at column 2, you see that we're holding growth absolutely constant. We're projecting $2.217 billion for this year, and we're assuming no growth at all. If you look at column 10, we're assuming zero additional application of interest and sinking fund taxes. So this is a worst case scenario. The voters approved 38.01 cents. This worst case scenario shows a 34.8 cent INS tax rate. That's about 10% less than the voters had approved in terms of an overall tax rate. It's about 3.25 cents below that level. Do we want to go all the way to 34.8 cents? There's a couple of reasons why we might, but there are also opportunities to reduce that. We are still sticking with the plan, subject to board approval, of course, of stair-stepping the tax rate. But this is a worst case scenario, and we like it. It's 10% better than we told the voters. So as elected officials, you all can be very proud of what you've accomplished as an organization. The next page shows the same thing in most respects. If you look at column 2, again, we're projecting no growth. Now, we know we just recently had a pretty healthy piece of growth, but we know just 2 years ago it fell 3.97%. So the average, as Mr. Greer pointed out, your average growth over the last 10 years has been 2.14%. Your average growth in the last 5 years has been 3.07%, so still very modest growth. Now the question becomes: do we have fund balance? Do we have surplus INS fund balance to continue to mitigate the tax rate, to continue to stair step the impact that the voters approved back in 2018? And this is a number that we did not have an opportunity to discuss in great detail with Ms. Barberg before the meeting.
I have it now.
You've got the number now? And what is that?
4.3 million.
That's what you have today. Okay, great. So this, based on that $4.3 million, this number may be a little bit too optimistic, and let me explain why. If you look at column 11, your debt service between now and 2028 is approximately $6 million a year. The question becomes, given the volatility and the growth of their tax base, which again declined just a couple of years ago, what is a reasonable reserve that you would want to have on hand at all times in the event that your taxable assessed valuation falls again and you don't want to have to increase your INS account? Mr. Greer and I discussed it. I think, I've been doing this for 38 years. I feel very comfortable saying that your minimum reserve, I believe, ought to be about $3 million, about half of that $6 million number, okay? It gives you 6 months worth of reserves. Most of our personal households hopefully have 6 months' worth of cash reserves. So if Ms. Barbrick's telling us that the number is $4.3 million, the difference between 4.3 million and 3 million means we've got about $1.3 million that we can use to continue to subsidize the tax rate with. This number shows about $2.1 million, so it's too optimistic. We were not able to confirm that before we arrived today. So what I would say, I might remind the superintendent when Clarence and I were here a couple of days ago, or last month, I think we had kind of ballparked it at 32.5 cents, and that looks like where it needs to be. Since we only have 1.3 million instead of 2.1 million, the 32 cents that you see in column 12 probably ought to be about 32.5 cents. That would be, in my opinion, the minimal sustainable tax rate that you should go to. And again, the minimal. Now, what's interesting, and this is exciting for bond guys, for number guys like Mr. Greer and myself, is if you look further down column 12, where it's the 32 cents is blocked, you see then it falls to 31.54, less than 32 cents, even with no fund subsidization. Why does that happen? It's because you're paying off some old debt. It falls again to 26.81 cents in 2029. That's exciting because what that means is that within your existing tax rate, tax framework, you have capacity to issue potentially additional debt and be able to legitimately tell the voters your total nominal tax rate is not going to have to go up because you're creating debt capacity as your old debt pays off. And then the next slide is again a little different. What's primarily different about this slide is that if you look at column 2, we have gone back and instead of holding the growth rate constant, we have gone ahead and allowed there to be some growth in the tax rate, in the tax base. You see 3% growth has been built into that, okay? So assuming that we get that growth, I think the difference would be that and you were to assume the same 32.5 cents that I outlined the previous page, what that allows us to do is to not draw that fund balance down as much as we had to, preserve more than just $3 million in reserves in the event that we continue to have volatility in the tax base. If that volatility does not appear, if you continue to have more growth, then you'll have the opportunity to either lower that tax rate or, again, start calculating what other capital improvements that the community might need and can be addressed without a subsequent tax rate increase. When I was here with Mr. Greer and we visited with senior administration, Clarence and I talked about a strategy that he and I, as team members on the Dallas ISD account, implemented 7 years ago. We call it a constant INS tax rate strategy. And the idea being that the school board adopted an INS tax rate that, irrespective of what the growth in the community was, we weren't going to have a tax rate that was higher than that or a tax rate that was lower than that. There have been some fantastic results at Dallas ISD. We voted in 2015 $1.6 billion. And then in 2018, we voted another $300 or $400 million. And then in 2020, we voted $3.6 billion. So in the past 5 or 6 years, we have approved over $5.5 billion, billion with a B, and maintain the INS tax rate at 24.2 cents. Through that entire period of time, the tax rate never changed. There were times when we did not need 24.2 cents because the growth in that community was so great. What do you do there? You could lower the tax rate, but in fact, again, in keeping with the constant INS tax rate mentality, we had callable bonds out there, and the district paid off debt early. We called in long out bonds that weren't going to mature for many, many years at 5 and 6% interest rates and just paid them off early rather than lower the tax rate. When we needed more than 24.2 cents, we had surplus INS fund balances that we were able to use, as this district has done, to buy that tax rate down. So it has worked very, very well. has paid off debt a lot quicker than we were expecting to pay off debt, in addition to allowing us to issue $5.5 billion worth of debt with no increase.
And did you
So,
say the Dallas rate was like 24 cents?
24.2 cents on, that's just the debt rate, it's not the
Right.
total, just the debt rate. Now, of course, you guys are at $2 billion in tax value. If I remember correctly, Dallas is like $169 billion. So it's a little different tax-based
Oh, yeah,
scenario.
absolutely.
But the concept can be very much the same here. As you look at column 12 and you see let's look at column 11 and 12 together, and you see how debt service is going to be falling in the coming years, and your tax rate is going to be falling. This assumes the average growth of the last 5 years, which has been slightly over 3%, but it only goes out 5 years. If we can adopt a constant INS tax rate strategy, and that number be 32.5 cents, or it could be going back to page 6, it could be as high as 34.8 cents. We cannot levy a tax rate in excess of what's actually required to be debt service. By state law, we can't do that. So you can consider, again, the worst case scenario is 34.8 cents. If we were to adopt a constant INS tax rate strategy at somewhere between the 32.5 cents and the 34.8, two things can happen. One is, as the community continues to grow, and we've seen recent growth, we all know all about the residential subdivisions that are coming into the community, we can continue to finance additional improvements without another increase in INS tax rates. The difference between, for example, I calculated it very quickly, between 34.8 cents and what your tax rate would otherwise be, 31.85 starting in 2025, which is only 3 fiscal years down the road, right? The difference between those two things is $14 million in debt. With virtually no growth, we could say, in 3 years, we could come back and issue $14 million worth of debt and not have to increase your tax rate at all. Now, that's not to encourage you to spend money. Nobody wants to have you vote bonds and spend money that doesn't need to be spent. So what happens if you don't need to spend it? Your existing debt, if you look at the bottom of that page, does not pay off until 2049. When the bonds were sold in 2019, they were put out there for 30 years. What we can do is the same thing that Dallas ISD does. If you don't need the money for new capital improvements, we start using that same money to pay this debt off early. We have saved, last time I calculated the number, and help me here, something like $800 million in interest that the taxpayers of Dallas ISD don't have to pay because of debt we paid off early. And the same thing can happen here at Nacogdoches ISD.
So there's no penalty for paying it off early?
I'm sorry?
There's no penalty for paying it off early at any time?
Yes and no.
Okay.
There's no penalty, certainly. That's for sure. However, when you deal in the fixed income markets, it's typical that you would have a 9-year par call on the bonds, meaning that you can't call them at all, premium or no. You can't call them at all in advance of that call date. But if you go back to page 4, we still have debt in 2015 and 2016 that you see on the 2015 debt, that first call date is 2/15 of 25, all right? And on their 2019 debt is 2/15 of 28. We can start calling that debt in on those dates with no penalty. And so the benefit to the taxpayers of Nacogdoches ISD is that we get to, it's like everyone who's got 30-year mortgages on their homes, we get to substantially lower the interest that the taxpayers in your district have to pay by paying off that debt early. And there was a lot of discussion, as I'm sure you recall, when we did the bond election in 2018, how far do we go out? Do we go out 20 years? Do we go out 25 years? Do we go out 30 years? Because of the tax rate impact, which I applaud this community tremendously. It's not very many communities can approve a bond transaction with a projected INS tax rate of 21 cents, but you guys did that. And you needed to do it given the condition of your facilities and the amount of money involved. We can mitigate that now. We can adopt an INS tax rate that in the event that you don't need that money, we use it to pay off this debt early and realize all the savings of interest that have been discussed prior to that election when we were considering doing either a 20-year, 25-year, or a 30-year transaction. So this is something I think ought to be seriously considered by the board and could be beneficial to the board and the community in two respects. Again, one, if you need additional capital improvements, you're going to have some capacity to do it without an additional nominal tax rate increase. Number two, if you don't have additional capital improvements, we can use that same tax rate to pay off your existing debt substantially earlier, saving the taxpayers potentially millions of dollars in interest. Again, I know I talk with a funny Northeast Texas accent. But
I have a question for you, Marshall Maverick. I go up there all the time to ETBU on the board.
Okay.
The question is what we appear to be having is elevation in prices, and some people call that inflation. So if that continues, how does that affect this? Because if we're going to do maintenance and upkeep and keeping things going, it costs more for materials and more for labor. So we can't do everything ourselves. Our new high school is hitting 44 years old in 2022. And we have many, many 50-year-old schools in this district. So that means a lot of repairs. So I don't even know if this is the appropriate time, but just what happens when inflation hits this? We might not have a surplus.
You might not have a surplus, and obviously, as you're pointing out, any improvements that you need to do are going to cost more and more money down the road. To answer your question, I'll go back to page 8 and look at column 12, and you see that the calculation that I made of debt capacity, assuming the difference between 34.8 cents and 31.85 cents, was based on your debt service, or your tax rate rather, in 2025. That's $14 million. But look, if you go down just to 2027, it drops to under 29 cents. And then in 2029, this is great. From a banking perspective, this is great because 2029 is literally just 7 budget periods down the road. We had to adopt a long-term perspective. Now your tax rate is under 25 cents, and that assumes 4 years of no growth at all between 2025 and 2029. So to answer your question, I think this constant tie-in-S tax rate strategy helps address the questions of inflation, because given the structure of your existing debt, as inflation takes place, your tax base is going to rise. Yes, your costs are going to rise, but your tax base is also going to rise. Your debt service is declining, and your capacity, therefore, and when I say capacity, I mean within the framework of a constant INS tax rate, your capacity is increasing. So inflation is not good for any of us. None of us like it, but it is a fact of life. This is a strategy to deal with it. Now, this is a strategy, as Clarence said when we first started the presentation, all of variables change. Right now, we know that your INS tax rate, and this goes back to a comment Ms. Fitch made, if you go back to page 5 for just a moment, look at the third column from the right, the M&O tax rate. You were at $1.17. Because of compression, you fell to $1.07. You're projected now at $1.05. Senate Bill 1, which was just passed out of the Texas State Legislature earlier this week, is going to compress that even further. So if you look at your total nominal tax rate, your M&O tax rate, because of state compression based on federal dollars, and we're all familiar with what's going on with Senate Bill 1, your tax rate, M&O tax rate, if it's fully passed, will likely be under $1 next year. We could take the INS tax rate from that 24.5 cents that you see in 2022 up to, let's say, the worst case scenario of 34.8 cents. And so that's a dime increase. So now you're looking at probably a total tax rate of 29.39, $1.32,
Wow.
right? More or less. And $1.32 is still less than the total nominal tax rate that the taxpayers had before they voted for the bonds back in 2018, which was $1.3325. So inflation is a two-edged sword, but I think what's important is this school board and this community came together in a monumental way. Again, I've been doing this for 38 years. I've seen a lot of school districts fail bond elections because there was going to be a 3 or 4 or 5 cent INS tax rate increase. You guys had over a 21 cent INS tax rate, and your voters approved it at a rate of 65%. So bravo to the school board, bravo to the voters in the community. But with that kind of community support, and you can deliver $70 million worth of improvements, almost $80 million worth of improvements, and have a total nominal tax rate of less than when you started is a phenomenal result.
So there's room there for the capital outlay if we needed it without a very significant increase, right?
There is. And while we're talking about other capital outlay, and one of the things that the board member mentioned was maintenance. If you go back to page, bear with me here, Clarence, page 4, you'll see that you guys have got a $7.9 million qualified school construction bond note that was issued in 2009, and if you look at the final maturity about 2/3 of the way to the right, that debt pays off on August 15th of 2024, 2 budget periods down the road, right? The school district has been escrowing money to the tune of about $380,000, $390,000 per year. When that payment comes up in just 2 years, the amounts due under that note will be fully funded. It's not going to have a negative impact on your M&O budget. The point being is that in addition to the capacity that we've been discussing on the voted INS tax rate side, you're going to have some additional capacity on the M&O side within the framework of your existing budget to handle maintenance things. And there is a difference, of course, between what is allowed for the expenditure of M&O monies for capital improvement, which can be maintenance and upkeep, versus brand new capital improvements, which are required to be done by voting.
I want to thank you because my next question was going to be the compression of tax rates legislated, and you already answered that. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know you guys have got places to be at 1 o'clock, so I don't want to run this too long.
I just want to point out and make sure I understood you correctly there, because I get excited about this stuff too. So based on what you're saying and further compression of the tax rate, so basically in 2018, when voters approved this bond, we were at a total tax rate of $1.3325. With what the state's doing on the compression and all that, what I'm hearing you say is we could end up netting out at $1.32 when we make these changes.
I haven't done the math completely, but I think it's going to be very close. I think,
wow.
I think
well,
what's
in that
going to happen
neighborhood,
is,
that's incredible.
I think what's going to happen is that what we would recommend, and this is a political decision for the board.
Right.
How quickly do you want to draw down your INS fund balances? What's the optimal sustainable rate? Do you want to adopt a constant INS tax rate strategy? But assuming that we go from 24.5 to say 34.5 for ease of math, the worst case scenario is 34.8, right? So that goes up a dime, but because of the compression on the M&O side, your M&O tax rate's likely to fall between 5 and 7 cents. So your total tax rate, I think, is going to be about $1.32, $1.33, $1.34, something in there.
Somewhere in that range.
Yeah, you're very close to that number.
Well, and if you look back in 15, 16, 17, we were at $1.35. So
Exactly.
I think that's very exciting news for the community. If this board says we love this strategy and we want to pursue this constant INS strategy, what steps would we need to take?
Well, truthfully, at this point, there's no steps to be taken until your next
Just to
budget period. when
just
you
to
get ready set your
communicate that
tax
this
rate
is
next time.
all right.
Because of your existing debt structure, the debt that's already been issued, and what we know about the tax base, your tax rate, your unsubsidized INS tax rate is going to calculate out 34.5, 34.8 cents. Maybe less if we get a lot of growth, maybe more if we see what's happened in the last, 2 or 3 times where your tax base actually fell. But plus or minus, it's going to go to the 34 and a half cents, more or less. I would recommend that when you come to your budget and setting your tax rates next year, you do not assume any use of additional surplus INS tax rates, tax balance. Now, we all know how the truth in taxation rules work, and we have to disclose that. We've got to be fully transparent with the voters. This is what our fund balance is. This is what we consider to be a reasonable reserve. I think, the reasonable reserve, of course, is a subjective number. If this were a school district that consistently had 5 and 6% annual growth in their tax base for 5 or 6 years in a row, then you'd have less justification for a higher fund balance. But this is a school district, in fact, going back to page 4 or 5, you've seen declining tax bases, flatter declining tax bases 3 years out of the last 8. So you're in a more volatile situation. I think at a minimum, you ought to have 6 months worth of your debt service as a reasonable reserve. And I think having 7 months or 8 months with 4.3 million is not an indefensible position. And voters are going to say you got $4.3 million. Why? Well, the answer is we've got a volatile tax rate, base rather, and we don't, if the tax base declines like it did 4% just 2 years ago, we don't want to have to increase your tax rate. Mm-hmm. We want to maintain a constant tax rate. Even if our tax base declines, we're going to have enough surpluses to not have to increase your tax rate on a nominal basis.
I like that approach.
Now, there is one thing, and again, in the interest of full disclosure, I do go to church and Boy Scout and all that kind of stuff. I want to be clear that this board understands that what the state legislature is doing with respect to compression in Senate Bill 1 is a temporary fix. It's something that's based on the COVID numbers, the state legislature's decision on how to spend those COVID revenues. It's a biennium piece of legislation. And even the, what do you call them, the sponsors of that legislation is telling everybody, we may not have to, in this next biennium after this, they may have to go back up because we may or may not have additional federal money. So when we talk about the tax rate being, back down to $1.33 based on, what's happening with Senate Bill 1, I think that's honest, true thing to say for this biennium. It may not be true for the next biennium, and I don't want to be part of making, promises that I'm not in a position to keep. Sure. We don't know. But the good news is, again, looking at page 5, is that without this compression, we're only talking about a nickel's worth of difference anyway, or 5 to 7 cents worth of difference anyway.
Can you speak a little bit to, when we visited, you've been working very closely with Dr. Hinojosa with Dallas.
Yes, sir.
And to Dr. Groman's point, capital projects, it's so volatile, the changes in the direction, even though that may be the direction that this board may decide to go. But also, there are other options. Dr. Hinojosa looked at investing in the human capital.
Yes.
As well. And so being an opportunity to address that, could you speak a little bit to that aspect of it to the board? Because it's not always just the physical sites, but it's also the human capital side.
Well, there is a human capital side to this, and I applaud Dr. Hinojosa and the entire board at Dallas ISD for their very forward thinking on this. And when the Citizens Committee was putting together that $3.6 billion package, a significant part of every presentation they went through was how do we deal with racial equity, how do we deal with disparate geographic inequities, how do we deal with transportation issues. A lot of those things, as it pertains to, again, to human capital, impact obviously the M&O side of your budget rather than the INS tax rate side. A lot of those kinds of things can be addressed by making sure we address inequities in different campuses that we have around the community. That's a harder thing to do, to be honest with you, in a smaller community like Nacogdoches, because inevitably you build one campus, right? and you're comparing now a brand-new campus to a campus that, by definition, is 40 years old, down the road. And so it's more difficult because you have fewer campuses by which to diversify, the economic opportunities for upgrading. We talked a little bit about the school building bonds that are pay off in 2024. That is an M&O thing, and we can, by choosing either to use debt on the M&O side to address some inequities, or choosing not to use debt at all, and using that cash flow that had been previously assigned to debt to address human issues, to address, early childhood learning, getting laptops in the hands of students that have, special needs, those kinds of things. So the good news is money is fungible. The bad news is it's not 100% fungible. We do have to allocate between what's legally can be done on the M&O side versus what can be done on the interest and sinking fund side.
The reason I mention that is, as a board, COVID has allowed us to do certain things, put technologies in the hands of kids. If Christian was in the room, it's amazing. We've got it all set up. But what is the replacement cycle? What is that? How are we going to sustain what we've already started? Whereas end of life with certain things as we're working with is going to hit, and then that together, this board will have to decide, what does that look like? And if we don't have a contingency plan as to what that looks like down the pathway, we're not being good stewards, because some of these dates is going to be end of life for some of these things.
Absolutely.
That COVID brought into our, so we've got to be very mindful to our community to say, if we love what our kids are able to do right now, this is the long-range plan, so that we can continue to excel and do the things and provide the things. And that goes with quality teachers as well.
Quality teachers and quality management by Ms. Barber and her team, and,
Yes.
and of course yourself and the superintendent and the deputy superintendents. There's another strategy that I like to promote, not with school districts so much, because it's not as applicable to school districts, but I also represent about 35 cities and about 20 counties. I've been blessed. I have got about 100 governmental entities that I work with. And for cities and counties, there's a strategy we talk about called funded depreciation, and it has to do with assigning useful life to your rolling stock. So if you're a city and you've got police cars, you've got computers, you've got road equipment, understanding that you don't want to go out and issue debt for replacing those types of things, we assign, just as you're talking about, useful life. In the case of school districts, computers. What is the useful life? What's your goal in terms of getting technology into the hands of the students? What's the useful life of that? How are you going to pay for it? Is it going to be an interest sinking fund, or is it going to be a maintenance and operation thing? And when are you going to need to cycle into new equipment? And so by assigning useful lives and doing what we do in the city and county government business of funded depreciation, we can create a line item in the M&O side that basically is building up a reserve over a period of time to meet the replacement needs of that sort of short-lived technology issues.
I like it.
Very good.
I would retire, but I actually kind of love this stuff.
There's questions. I'm going to take a minute to get on one of my soapbox issues. And if you look at page 9 in his presentations over on the next steps, the very first item he mentions is maintaining a close watch on the district's TAV with the appraisal district. And that's an area that in Nacogdoches we've struggled with for a number of years. We've failed the state's property value study, and that's when the comptroller's office basically comes in and they're saying, appraisal district, did you do your due diligence and appraise all the property correctly? And we are on a path where we have continually, over a series of years, failed that property value study. And I think that this board has got to maintain its due diligence in making every effort to compel the appraisal district to get those property values where they need to be. And that will have a direct impact on this tax rate as well.
Absolutely. We just came back, as you know, from the TASB conference in Dallas, and I had the opportunity to spend an evening, actually, with an appraiser who worked for a delinquent tax attorney firm. And we spent a lot of time talking about what his role is within that delinquent tax attorney group to work with his school district clients on exactly that bullet point, on exactly those issues, because of all the issues that we know of how inaccurate local appraisals can negatively impact the revenues that you're getting as an individual school district from the TEA. So he pushes that issue. That's one thing. His name's Woodrow, and which I kind of thought was fun, being a
There you
Texan. But we had a very nice
We may need some more
conversation.
information about that gentleman.
So, I appreciate you covering the next steps in key considerations. I was actually going to let Clarence wrap that up.
No, and the last one, great segue to the last bullet on next steps, additional capital improvement priorities. Just wanted to make sure.
Hey, Clarence, can I have you get on the mic? Because
Yes.
there are probably some folks tuning in, and we want them to hear. You got some
Yes, sir.
valuable information.
Yes, sir. So just wanted to bring that to highlight the history on, as we reviewed the projects. Remember, if you look at our ADA column back in 2018, 2017, the prevailing thought at the time was there are certain projects that if we were to construct or go forward with might recover some students.
Amen.
And so we want to make sure what the last bullet is really speaking to is, how does the board feel about that recovery process? How are we measuring it? Are there other projects that, because things have changed since we're in a post-pandemic world, that we now need to shuffle some things around that, as a board, you might feel that is more impactful than versus when we were having that discussion back in 2017 through 2018. And when you just look at the numbers itself, it looks like, the ADA has gone up since 2018 versus today. But was that based upon the expectations that you thought it would go up by? The implications of ADA obviously has, Lisa and her team, her staff, with regards to the M&O budget. More students you recover. The funding formulas work to your advantage typically. And so that's something that was what the last bullet kind of speaks to. And it also points to what Mr. Henderson was saying, is having that dry powder, that ability to, whatever that magic rate we're going to focus in on, we should also set that in light of how much dry powder you may need to have in order to have another bond election with no tax rate increase. Because if there's another project out there that you say, well, we really need to cover that as well, we might have to inch it up a little bit higher, perhaps, or depending on values, to grow a little bit more than what we demonstrated. So those are some of the variables that we're looking to the board and staff to kind of give us some direction, and we can come back to you with some more scenarios. This has been a great discussion.
When we're speaking about the capital improvement priorities, what's recommended? How far out do we look at that? Do we look at that the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years? What's your recommendation?
Oh, I will tell you all of the above. I think that when I advise my clients, I want them to be looking 3 to 5 years in advance in pretty good detail, 8 to 10 years out with moderate detail, and 15 and 20 years out with the big picture level. So you're looking 3 to 5 years at the 3,000 foot level in the airplane. 8 to 10, you're looking at 10,000 foot. 15 to 20 years, give me a 35,000 foot view. But you want to look at all of it. One of the things that I'm gonna tell you about. No, I'm not either. It's late.
Well, that was
all
a
of
great,
the above, sir.
that's a great question, and it lends itself and that's why we've got these gentlemen here with us today. On the 21st, when we have our board meeting, we'll have the demographer come in and present information with regards what are current trends and what does the forecast look out. So it's intentional on how well-informed this board is becoming by understanding this dynamic, but also looking at what does a projection look like when the demographer comes in and does a report. And perfect question, because at that point, what is he saying will happen in 5, 10 years? And as a board, we can utilize the information we're having here to compare it with the information we're hearing from the demographer, so we can be informed on what is the long-term plan that we have to make as a district. And I want to make a mention about the ADA. Yes, we've got to get the kids here. Matter of fact, this board made it clear, let's get the kids back in here. But I will tell you, that's why I asked the question with regards to human capital. Human capital needs and must be addressed in order to meet the needs so that we get and maintain and retain the great teachers that we have. We don't lose our kids. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at that opportunity with the leadership of our campuses, the leadership of this team, and the classroom teachers that are there. So looking at all the pieces, there's intentionality in all the programming and all the presenters that we're having. So, Mr. Montoya, great question. How do we plan? He said all of the above, which means on the 21st, whenever the demographer presents information, he'll have some valuable insight as to what that may look like, and maybe have us reevaluate some things of what our plans are, and maybe we've got to reevaluate some things of what we're looking for in the long-range plan. So some of those answers will maybe be revealed here real soon. So, thank you, President Finch.
Thank you for those
Thank you.
comments. Any additional questions? All right, hearing none, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we adjourn.
Thank you. We've got a motion to adjourn by Mrs. Winslow. Do we have a second?
She just got here.
I know. That's what I was like, I don't know if I should even make it.
I'll second.
Thank you. We have a second by Reverend Irvin. All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you all for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.